Thank you so much. So yes, I today want to talk about wildfire smoke exposure. So before I do that, I want to do a little bit of a background on me. I am a community engaged toxicologist. So a lot of the work I'll talk about today is really about how we've done the wildfire smoke exposure. So less of the results of what we're finding and more how have we managed to do community engaged research around wildfire smoke disasters and all the challenges that come with that. Um, I always like to show this slide. It makes my job seem much more exciting than it really is. I would say 99% of the time it's me in front of a computer, but just to give you a sense of the different types of community engaged work that we have done, we have put out air samplers in rural Ohio looking at unconventional natural gas drilling. We have sampled subsistence foods with several tribes in the Pacific Northwest. We've used silicone passive sampling wristbands to evaluate personal exposure to contaminants. We've also used those wristbands after Hurricane Harvey to look at chemicals that people might be exposed to. So a variety of different tools that we've used to measure what people are exposed to and then understand what those exposures might mean. So in my lab, what we're really interested in is understanding how we can use toxicological and exposure data to help answer or address community questions or concerns with then the goal of hopefully improving public health by reducing or preventing exposure. And so in my group, the way we tend to do that really is by reporting back the results of our studies directly to study participants and their communities. And so, like I said, I'm not going to talk about that today, but if anyone does have questions about it, I'm more than happy to talk about how we do report back, particularly in the context of a disaster setting. So as I mentioned, I do most of my work is community engaged. I put this image up because I think it's not entirely accurate to say that everything is either community engaged or investigator initiated. There's quite a bit of overlap between them. And so this is adapted from an image. It was developed by Liam O'Fallon and Sima Finn, who are NIEHS program officers, where they sort of outlined that in the more traditional scientific model, sort of at the top, we start with our own expertise, we draft our questions, we develop our study, we go through the traditional model where it ends in a peer-reviewed publication. In community-initiated research, you might start more with community concerned over an exposure or a disease hazard, and you work out your question with your community partners, and then you go through that process. And I added the arrows here to sort of show there have absolutely been times communities have said, hey, we're concerned about this. You go off, do your thing, figure it out, come back to us. So we can sort of see those parallels in different ways across the study. So the different studies I'll talk about today are all kind of on this spectrum of community engagement. So I'm going to spend most of my time talking about our wildfires. Wildfire smoke has largely impacted everyone in the US at this point. Here in Oregon, where I am, I'm at Oregon State University in Corvallis. Corvallis really started being impacted by wildfires in 2020, but the rest of the state has been impacted for much longer. And I put up one, it's surprisingly difficult to get statewide distributions of wildfire smoke impacts, but this is Bend. Bend is one of our larger cities. It is also going to be more southeastern, so it's been impacted by wildfire smoke for far longer than other parts of the state. And what I'm showing here was put together by the Oregon DEQ, and we're just looking at wildfire smoke by AQI quality. And so I'm sure people are familiar with the air quality index. I have the little graphic here on the left. What we really want is to be in that green zone, below 50, which if you convert the air quality index to the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for PM 2.5, that is 9 micrograms per meters cubed. So we're really looking for AQI below 50. And what you can see on the graph is that over time, we're really seeing an increase in the number of days per year that are exceeding even 100 on that air quality scale, or 35, which is the 24-hour daily limit that we do not want to exceed for PM 2.5. What I also wanted to point out with this, and I'm sure a lot of you know this, we're not actually seeing more wildfires, but we are seeing larger wildfires and greater severity of wildfires. And so I was sort of looking for impacts of wildfire smoke across the US, and I came across this very recent paper published last December that just shows the impact of wildfires across the US. And what you'll notice is we're not seeing a strong trend for increasing numbers of wildfires. And so that's really what we're seeing is same sort of number, but increased severity of the fires. The last thing I wanted to mention about the wildfire trends that we're seeing is historically, at least in Oregon, it was really considered more of a rural problem, which is still makes it a very significant problem. What we're seeing increasingly is fires at this wildland-urban interface, where we're seeing metropolitan areas that are being burned as well. And so when we look across, and this paper looked from 1999 to 2020, we're seeing almost equivalent numbers of tracts that are being burned by wildfires in metropolitan as well as rural areas. And that is absolutely what we're seeing here in Oregon as well as California, and I think increasingly across the US. From a exposure science standpoint, how we actually study wildfires, that can have some impacts, and I can talk a little bit about that. So when we're looking at wildfire smoke from an exposure science standpoint, sorry, words are hard, the main things that we have focused on have been particulate matter 2.5, so PM 2.5. Our groups at Oregon State. So I am part of our Superfund Research Center as well as our Environmental Health Sciences Center. We have quite a bit of expertise around polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So specifically, we're interested in the vapor phase of these compounds, which tends to be fairly understudied relative to pHs that exist in the particle-bound phase. We have increasingly been moving beyond simply characterizing contaminants in wildfire smoke to trying to understand the impacts of exposure on respiratory health, cognitive disease, and then reproductive health. So I would say most of our work has been in the respiratory health area. Over the last few years, we've increasingly had community partners reach out with concerns about wildfire smoke exposure during gestation, particularly the second trimester of pregnancy. And very recently, we have several teams that I'm part of that are becoming interested in the potential impact of wildfire smoke, either inducing or worsening cognitive disease, so dementia or Alzheimer's related diseases. All right, so I did all of this background on wildfires. I'm going to sort of pull back to the broader question of just challenges with doing disaster research. At Oregon State, particularly in our Superfund Research Center, in about 2016, we started getting really interested in how we can improve our response to these environmental conditions when there are so many uncertainties. And so we kind of broke it down into these buckets and we said, what are all the challenges? And once we know the challenges, how can we design our studies and design our methods to best work within these constraints? So obviously the first challenge is knowing where. So in the Pacific Northwest, we unfortunately do have maps. We know which areas of Oregon are far more prone to wildfires. Um, and we can just base that off of historical trends. We can base that off of where we know drought has been occurring, etc. So we know where, we kind of know the when. Our wildfire season has been, for the last few years, starting around June 15th, going to about end of October. That said, the when is a little more complicated. It's trying to figure out exactly when wildfire smoke will hit a certain community is actually pretty difficult. The best tools that we have, we can predict out about 3 days. So if I was to look at the maps, I might be able to say, all right, I think with decent certainty, wildfire smoke will be in this region for the next 3 days. I also, even then, we used our best tools. We once deployed an entire study. We were very certain that an area was going to be hit by very heavy wildfire smoke. Everyone put their samplers on, and the very next morning the wind shifted and that area was not hit by wildfire smoke at all. So that remains a challenge. Um, from a more broad standpoint, trying to figure out the type of disaster, obviously we have over time sort of honed in. We're more interested in, excuse me, looking for wildfire smoke. We're also still challenged by the severity. It can be very difficult to tell with a wildfire smoke plume how much people will actually be exposed to. Uh, I'll try not to go into too many exact details, but for anyone that has ever tracked wildfire smoke, you'll know there's multiple different tools you can do that with, and one of them is the NOAA hazard mapping tool, which is a really excellent tool, but it's using satellite imagery. And the difficulty with that is that you can't always tell the height of the smoke. So in some cases, we're seeing very strong smoke, but that smoke is actually so high up in the atmosphere that people are not being exposed. So that is another challenge that we've been dealing with. And then finally, getting access to locations, as you can imagine, sites that are actively on fire, that is going to pose quite a bit of difficulty doing your science. We were just chatting before the seminar, and tornadoes as well, right? Getting access can be really difficult when you have an area that has been truly devastated by these disasters. And then, of course, ethical approval. Most of my research is sampling humans, and so that can be putting samplers on humans, it can be having them fill out surveys, etc. But getting an IRB in the context of a disaster can be very difficult. I know for us, an IRB, if it falls under an exempt category, we can have that within under a week. If it does not fall under one of those exempt categories, it could be several months, at which point you may be now 3-4 months post-disaster, and the type of data that you wanted to collect may have perished in that time. So these were all of the challenges that we faced when trying to consider how to do our research. So I'll start with some broad ways that we've addressed these challenges, and then I'll go through some specific studies to discuss how we addressed those specifically. So the first, I imagine many of you on this call are familiar with disaster IRBs or the RAPID protocol. We developed this in 2016, where we used quite a bit from the RAPID protocol, but then we also looked to try and understand how can we build this for our technologies. And so quite a bit of the work I do is with Kim Anderson, who uses passive samplers, particularly the passive wristband sampler. So we walked through the main things. How are we going to recruit people? What specific samplers, like the wristband, will we use? Are there different surveys that we might use based on the disaster type, disaster severity, exposure scenario? How do we want to consent people? And are we going to report back to individuals? And so we put in templates. And so like for the surveys, we identified multiple surveys through the FENX toolkit. And we said, these are the surveys we would use by disaster type. And then when a disaster happens, we're able to quickly modify our protocol. We say, all right, we're going to do verbal consent. We're going to use the silicone wristband. Here's how we'll recruit. Here's the surveys we'll use. And we're able to make a very compact, personalized protocol. And then our IRB is able to review and return a decision within 48 hours based on that disaster. That was one of the first ways we were able to address the timing and the ethical concerns of doing disaster research. I did mention the questionnaires. This is a project that was led by University of Washington, who I've worked with for several years now, but we were both very interested in doing wildfire research and recognize that when you look at wildfire research, particularly at the type of data that's collected via questionnaires, there's not a lot of standard questionnaires that are being used by wildfire exposure researchers. So Lillian Liu was the PhD student that led this up at University of Washington. And together we just searched through all of the literature, we searched through standard questionnaire banks and said, what are different questionnaires that could be appropriately used after a wildfire event to better characterize health impacts? And we focused specifically on respiratory health for this first project. We're since expanding that. And we built a question bank with the idea being that folks that have a RAPID protocol or a disaster IRB can quickly go through, they can identify which questionnaires have been used, select those same for their study, and hopefully start building standardized questionnaires and data so that we can begin comparing between these studies, because that has been a challenge, particularly for wildfire smoke research, in my experience. All right, so with that very, very long background, I wanted to go through some of the wildfire smoke studies that we have done and discuss really the real world application challenges and mitigations that we've been able to put in place so that we can continue collecting high quality, rigorous data to address some of these questions. So very broadly, when we're doing this research, it ranges from the very basic science of evaluating vapor phase organic compounds and their impact on air quality, down to the health concerns that we have, again, looking at respiratory, reproductive, and cognitive health. But then underlying all of that are questions on how can we do the research in a way that we continue to get people enrolling. Often we have community members collecting data for us. So how can we make sure that they're able to access the samplers, able to collect data for us, and document it in an appropriate way? So with that, I'll start with one of our very first wildfire studies. This was led by Kim Anderson doing the sampling. My role was coming in, I did a lot of the research translation and reporting the data back to people. And so this image, we asked our graphic designer if they could create sort of like a tasteful wildfire image. But we put a passive sampler outside a home and then inside a home. And we sampled at the same locations before, during, and after a wildfire. And on paper, that sounds very easy. In reality, it took 3 years for us to be able to get those 3 sampling deployment periods at the same location. So because we don't always know exactly where a wildfire will hit or when, we just sort of used numbers to fix that issue. So we sampled at 13 different locations over 3 years between Washington, Oregon, California, and Idaho. And we knew with that spread, we did preferentially sample in areas that we knew were more prone to wildfires, just looking at historical trends. But with that spread, we figured every year we'd be able to capture some of the sites would have an active wildfire smoke exposure, some would not. And we could then over time get those before, during, and after. So importantly, one site's before that same time period might be another site's during or after. So it did bring a little bit of challenge once we got to the data analysis, but that was how we were able to get those different sampling periods that we were looking for. So of the challenges, as I already said, obviously predicting the when, where, and severity, kind of covered that. One of the things we did not think about was what happens if Corvallis, Oregon gets hit by severe wildfire smoke. So I'm showing this picture. This is actually my backyard in 2020, and it does look photoshopped. I fully admit that. It is not. It actually doesn't do this justice. The sky was red, and what you can't see is that I am actually getting ash rained down on me as we're putting out this sampler. So Corvallis was heavily inundated with wildfire smoke. And at first, one of the challenges of doing this work, right, is you never want to be happy when a wildfire hits. But from a scientific perspective, that is what we're looking for. So our first thought was, great, we'll put samplers out at locations through Corvallis. We can get some additional data. The problem was the wildfire smoke and actual ash inundated our laboratory facilities. So Kim, who was preparing these samplers, her laboratory was actually covered in ash. And as a result, she couldn't prepare any new samplers. So we were scrambling, and thankfully we did have some samplers in storage that were in airtight containers that we were then able to deploy. So we now have learned we always need to have some samplers prepared and ready to go, simply in the event that our laboratory becomes inundated with wildfire smoke again. As an aside, I can share this also happened during Hurricane Harvey. We partnered with several schools down in Houston, and their laboratories were literally underwater. So that was one of the reasons they partnered with us. We were able to prepare samplers and then fly them out and deploy them since their labs were inaccessible. The other issue we ran into is we were planning on mailing samplers to people. So a benefit of these samplers, they are very stable at room temperature, which means we can easily just mail them using the regular US Post Office. They stay stable for months. So the idea was we would mail them to people, they would set them up either again before, during, or after a wildfire, and we'd collect our data. The problem is the wildfires that we were hit with were so severe, there were significant evacuation zones. So there's three types of evacuation. One is called essentially the get out zone, which is as soon as you get that call, you are leaving immediately. There is also a prepare to leave zone, and then the final zone is be prepared. You might be upgraded to zone 2, but you're not evacuating anytime soon, hopefully. Many of our locations were in these bottom 2 zones. Now, the problem with that is the post office stopped delivering to those zones, which we had not foreseen. So as a result, we did miss some sampling because the samplers simply couldn't be delivered. And so the easy solution to that is we ended up mailing all samplers at the very start of wildfire season. Now, the downside is that meant they were hanging out in people's garages sometimes for months, but I can talk about how we addressed that a little bit. And then the final challenge was how do we actually give these research results back to people, recognizing that for many people this was a very traumatic event. People, you know, no one in our study, but people that they knew had lost homes, had been evacuated, etc. So, as I mentioned, predicting the when, where, and severity, there are tools that exist that we can use. I'm showing one such tool here. We also use the NOAA hazard mapping. Oregon has a daily smoke call where they talk about forecasts where we're able to see where they predict wildfire smoke will go. We also were able to sort of use numbers in our favor by simply looking at multiple states, multiple locations across those states to try and capture these events. In terms of deploying the samplers, as I mentioned, we did decide to mail them all out at the start of the season. The first year we did that, we saw compliance go down. And what we realized is people received the sampler, they read all of the instructions, and they said, okay, well, it's not time yet. I'll stick this all in the garage. But then when we did call them up a month or 2 later, in their brains, they were like, well, I already read all the instructions. I probably remember it all. So they just put things out. And they hadn't. So we have learned that when we now say to people, all right, we sent you stuff 2 months ago, we're going to ask you to put things out, we're following up with videos or with short instruction sheets to say, we know it's been a while since we sent you the sampler. Here's how we're going to ask you to do everything. And that has increased our compliance. And in terms of compliance, that is, are they setting the sampler up correctly? Are they wearing gloves? Are they documenting the start and stop times? Are they sealing the sampler appropriately back into the airtight bags before mailing it back to us? And our compliance has consistently been over 80%, and that's probably on the lower end. So we're seeing even higher compliance than that. This is really like the only results slide I am going to show, but as I mentioned, one of our challenges is how do we communicate results back to people? And for those of you that do any air quality work, I am sure you can relate to a lot of this. Especially in Oregon, one of the main things that has been told to people is during wildfire smoke, close your windows, right? You don't want to get any of that wildfire smoke in your home. And what we were finding with one of our studies, and so you can see here the yellow is the indoor sampler that we put in. And again, these are passive samplers, so we're only looking at vapor phase, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And then the sort of blue or tealy color is the outdoor samplers. And what you can see is that the lower AQI, we just pulled this from EPA monitors, indoor air was actually worse than outdoor air. And again, for those of you that study air quality, this is not a surprise for you. I can tell you this is a huge surprise for most members of the public that I was working with. And so what we actually found in our study, and we're seeing this in others, is that the air quality index actually has to get up fairly high to about 140 in our study before we see the switch, where indoor air is now better than outdoor air. So communicating that nuance, that it's not as simple as the second you think there's smoke, you should close your windows, but how really have a better understanding of what your indoor air quality might be like. And that can then inform how you might want to handle things. Do you want to close your windows? Do you want to turn on air conditioning? Install a clean air filter in your room, etc. So this was a more nuanced research finding that we needed to communicate to people. I'm also going to put this up. This was incredibly eye-opening to me. So In 2020, this was one of the worst wildfire events that Oregon had seen. This was, again, if anyone saw pictures from the time, we had the red skies, right? It looked like something out of a movie. I work quite a bit with Oregon State Extension. We are a land grant institution, so we have extension agents in every county. One of the women I work with, her name is Glenda Hyde. She was asked to do a radio show segment. And so the radio show reached out to everyone in their county and they said, we're all being impacted by wildfire smoke. What are the things you're doing to improve your air quality inside your home? And people called in with all of the hacks that they were using. And then Glenda and I researched them and were able to either dispel the myth or say, yes, this is working. And so what you're seeing on the left side in sort of the orangey boxes, these are all the things people called in with. And it ranged from people saying that they use like the Himalayan salt rock lamps to clean their air. They were blocking their dryer vent because they felt like that was preventing inundation of wildfire smoke into their home. Some people were running their shower 24/7. This one I get actually quite a bit. People were pouring bleach into a pot on their pan and then simmering it because they thought that would maybe clean the air quality, or plants or burning scented candles. And so it ranged from ineffective and harmless, like the salt rocks, to actually dangerous, which is blocking the dryer vent and simmering cleaning products on the stove. Notably, no one mentioned using a HEPA filter, a box fan, turning on air conditioning, wearing an N95 mask, or building a clean room. So we realized that it's not enough just to be doing this research. We need to address where people are with their current understanding. So this told me people recognize wildfire smoke is bad for their health, but they were not getting access to research-backed mitigations to reduce their exposure and improve their health. So now every time we do these studies, we make sure at the outset to provide people with information on how they can reduce their exposure if they would so like. And so that is really sort of the final thing that we're doing is we're making sure that we start that at the beginning, but at the end of the study and throughout, we are reporting back research results and study updates. And like I said, I'm not going to have time to talk about all of this. This really is my passion with the research, is how can we report data back to people in a way that is understandable, in a way that is accessible to them, and in a way that they can apply to their daily lives. So the most I'll say is we have a cover letter that provides sort of the take-home translation of the research. What did we find? For this study, we really focused on the fact that indoor air tended to be worse than outdoor air, except for very severe wildfire smoke inundation. We showed the data in sort of a summary aggregate form. And then we also give people their individual data. So it's difficult to see because I made it small here, but people could actually see where their indoor and outdoor sampler was in relationship to every other sampler in the study. So they could sort of see, where are they on the higher, lower, or right in the middle end. And then we have it separated by the 3 years that they participated. So this is one of the main ways that we feel it's important to help people reduce their exposure, but it's also helped keep people involved over these 3-year studies, particularly when we're looking at wildfire smoke, where it is all people think about from June to October, but then for the rest of the year, it's pretty far removed from what we're thinking of because we're in the rainy season. So this helps keep people engaged. We also found that people's concerns went in directions we had not anticipated. So a lot of Oregon is cattle farming, is produce farms. And so we had a lot of people writing into us saying, all right, I know I shouldn't be exposed to wildfire smoke, but after the fires, I went out, I harvested food from my garden. Should I be eating it? And I can personally attest, I am a home gardener. I went out, I picked an herb, I ate it. And I don't know if anyone has ever had barbecued oregano, but that's largely what it tasted like because of the impact of the smoke. So we worked with OSU Extension again, and we put out some very simple infographics to help address people's concerns of, is it healthy to eat produce right after a wildfire? What are steps you can take to reduce or to remove the ash, to remove any lingering effects of wildfire smoke? And then we had a lot of people saying, are there things I can do to prepare if I know wildfire season is coming up, are there certain foods I can eat that will sort of improve my health so that I'm better equipped to deal with the potential respiratory adverse effects that come with wildfire smoke? So we put these out. These have been very heavily used originally in Oregon, but we're now seeing them being adopted in states like New York as well, which is being impacted by wildfire smoke. And unfortunately, some of that wildfire smoke is even coming from Oregon and is being dumped all the way in New York. All right, so the second, I'm only going to talk about 3 studies, but the second study that I wanted to talk about was impact of wildfire smoke on reproductive health. I'm not going to go as deep into this one. This was a very much a preliminary study, really focused on the feasibility of recruiting pregnant individuals during a wildfire smoke event. And so the first issue we ran into really is that timeline. So we know that wildfires, again in Oregon, are going to span June through October, but now we also have to overlay the timeline of pregnancy, which is only going to be 9 months. Before I get into that, I'll mention that we did learn our lesson from the previous study. And so we started this by saying, what are concerns people have? And so we worked with our community partners to immediately put out an infographic collating what information we have about wildfire smoke during pregnancy, as well as providing options for people to reduce their exposure if they are concerned. So getting to the timing issue of this, I pulled this image from a 2012 paper. It's an excellent paper. I have no affiliation with any of this, but it was a really elegant study where they looked back in 2003. This was back when we were only getting about 1 wildfire at a time. So this took place in California. In 2003, there was only 1 wildfire. And as a result, they were able to pull all the pregnancy data, and they were able to look at babies that were born before the wildfire, so were never exposed, during pregnancies that were in their 3rd, 2nd, or 1st trimester, or born after. And they were able to look at the effect on preterm birth and low birth weight. And what they found is that exposure during any of the trimesters, 3rd, 2nd, or 1st, we did see, or they saw, a decrease in birth weight, but that effect was strongest in the 2nd trimester. So now we're not just looking at the full 9 months of pregnancy, but we're really focused on that 2nd trimester and looking at wildfire smoke exposure. So when we started planning this study, we pulled together clinicians, obstetricians, toxicologists, chemists, public health, community engagement folks, etc., and said, what is the best way we can time this? Because this is going to be complicated. And so I put up a very simple graphic, but what we knew is we needed to recruit people before wildfire season started so that they were ready to go. As soon as the first wildfire hit, we could have them sampling. But what that meant is just because someone was pregnant during recruitment, you can see in these gray bars, they might have given birth or give birth before wildfire season started. And so we knew we wanted to sample during a smoke event and then sample again without smoke. So people that were fairly advanced into their pregnancy before wildfire season were no longer eligible for our study. And so we really were trying to capture people that we could get in that 2nd trimester during wildfire season. What that means is we ultimately run into a numbers game. Is we know that only a small segment of the population is going to be pregnant at this time, and then we're filtering down even further. So ultimately, we were able to recruit. But the main lesson we learned from this is if we're going to do this again, we need to be recruiting across multiple states in order to get the numbers of people that we need to see an effect, but also just to be able to recruit within this fairly narrow window when we're overlaying pregnancy across wildfire smoke exposure. The second issue we ran into, I am not a parent. I have dogs, so this was a huge learning experience for me. We ran a lot of focus groups. And we said, when we're studying exposures that occur during pregnancy, what are things we need to know? And one of the very first things that came up, and this was a different study, this was done with Henry Ford Health and Wayne State out in Detroit. So this was not wildfires, but it was the same idea of exposure during pregnancy. And our community liaisons immediately said, well, mom guilt. You need to be aware of the fact that when you are studying us, you are studying what we're exposed to, but also what our fetus is being exposed to. And you never want to make someone feel unintentionally guilty that perhaps they were the reason that their child was born preterm, or they were the reason their child was born at a lower birth weight. Sorry. And so we struggled with that for a while, and thankfully our community liaisons were the ones that fixed it. And they said, you just need these two sentences. If you can make sure that when you're communicating with people, that you're studying this because you're concerned, but that it's not people's fault, right? They are existing in an environment, and there could be circumstances outside their control that could relate or could result in these exposures. And so this is the language that we use in most of our communications that just simply says, we know people are exposed to many different chemicals, but we don't know if these chemicals cause harm. As a parent, we know you want the healthiest baby you can have. And it's largely worked. We've focus grouped this quite a bit. We've done a lot of follow-up information with this. And when we've done pregnancy studies, this is what people take away from it. And they say, all right, we're helping contribute to understand if this could be of concern. And the work that we're doing may help future pregnancies, may help future births. So that was a really important understanding for us, and that just the way we're framing the research, we can frame it in such a way as to avoid unintentional harm. The other thing that we learned about this was the different types of resources to provide. So what I'm showing here is how we have really visualized resources for people. Is we want to provide resources that span low effort and low cost all the way to high effort and high cost. And the reason we started doing this is, in Oregon at least, historically, the recommendation's been when wildfire smoke occurs, turn on your air conditioning. And I'm sure this is very different out where y'all are, but here in Oregon, it's about 20% of homes and buildings have air conditioning. Now that's rapidly changing with new builds, but when I grew up in Washington, I didn't know anyone that had air conditioning. It simply wasn't needed. So now when guidance comes out and says turn on your air conditioning, that is not relevant for about 80% of our population. So there are portable air cleaners. Those are expensive, so it's low effort but high cost. We have put a lot of work into our studies to communicate throughout the process that there are things people can do during our study or once they see their results if they now feel it's necessary. But this can be a simple, we're very careful around the messaging on this, where we say, if you must go outside during severe wildfire smoke, wear an N95 mask to reduce your exposure. If the air quality is actually fairly low, you can open your windows if you're comfortable with that. We provide instructions for the DIY filter fans. So if you haven't seen that, you can take two HEPA filters and you tape them in a triangle shape to a box fan. So as it pulls air into the room, it's pulling it through those HEPA filters to clean it a little bit before it comes into your home. And then the EPA has provided recommendations for how to create a room in your house that is going to be fairly sealed to prevent inundation from outdoor air. You can put in an air cleaner or that box fan, and it's a place where your family can sit in that room. You're not trying to clean the entire house, but you're trying to provide your family one space where they can be breathing cleaner air through that. So this is something that we've now added to every study that we do with wildfire smoke, is provide multiple resources for people across this spectrum so that we're able to give everyone an option that works for their scenarios and their family and their situations. And so with that, I think hopefully I've given enough time that I can present. I didn't provide a lot of information on the cognitive health research that we're doing. That's something we are just starting, but I'm happy to address any questions about that. But I wanted to give a lot of thanks to everyone in my lab that's helped with this, both current and prior staff and students, as well as having worked with Kim Anderson for years. She's been a fantastic collaborator. Klamath County Public Health, they are the ones that are responsible for that pregnancy study that we did, as well as Linda Crocker-Daniel from Oregon Health and Science University. So with that, I am happy to take any questions from folks. Thank you all so much.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I have a quick question before I open it up to everyone else. My question is, so what has there been an issue yet that you haven't been able to solve on one of the pitfalls, or the you did such an elegant job of explaining all the different ones that you were able to solve, but is there one that's still out there that you haven't really been able to, when you're going to respond to these events that are always occurring quickly?
There's two that come to mind. The first is just humans. I think anyone that works with humans, we are a unique species, and we interpret things in vastly different ways. So we just did a study with the wristband, and we mail it to people in a little, it's a Teflon bag to keep things airtight. And so it's got a kind of unique sealer. So it's like a plastic rod inside a clip. We provide instructions. Uh, People took scissors to the bag so then they could never seal it up again. People have dropped the wristband in the toilet. They've played tug of war with the wristband with their dog. Um, what was the other one? Oh, they mail it back to us. They perfectly seal the bag, but not with the wristband in it, and mail it back to us. So those are absolutely edge cases, but those are sort of where we're still struggling with how do we help people put the wristband back in the bag. So that's more of a maybe a silly one. The other one that we can't solve, and I don't know that it's specific to wristbands, but when we get these chemical results, people want to know exactly what does it mean for their health. We're studying vapor phase, organic chemicals. Most of these don't have health guidelines or health standards. So I think it's a heightened concern when we're looking at these disasters and people are saying, these might be things I'm not normally exposed to, or I'm not normally exposed at these levels. Is that going to be worse for my health? And that is something that we're still really not able to address fully to their satisfaction.
Yeah, I concur with you on human studies out there, and being a human factors ergonomic uh, expert, I oftentimes can see how the human factor side of things, where you think you're doing this and you send it out with all these great instructions, and then you get it back and it's like, oh, never thought that would be the way they used it.
Yes.
But yes.
Yeah, and some of it, like the dropping it in the toilet, that was done by a kid.
Yep.
We kind of wish they hadn't sent that one back, but they did. Uh,
Yep. Is there anyone else that has a question? You just unmute yourself and
I guess I am curious if anyone in your center also does much report back of research results, either around disasters or just any of the other research, and if there's challenges that you've all run into.
so I have got reported back at more of the um not the individual basis. Oftentimes I'll give companies back their sort of the overall summary assessments. Um but I have not given back. Maybe some of the epidemiologists that are on, they may have provided. Arditha, that's probably a question more towards you of giving back to results back to individuals. On mute
I
still.
think
Unmute, good idea. Thank you. Because thank you for a wonderful talk, first of all. And I was just thinking about the questions that I have for you, which I do. The regarding our center, we are still pretty formative by comparison, and we are just moving into knowing that we need to work on wildfire is intriguing to us because it's periodic here. I guess you already know that from your national data. We get it, but it's from generally Canada or, more remote locations. But we realize as things get worse that we may face that in the Midwest. Right now, we have almost an excess of water, rainfall, and humidity most of the time. So we're not, but occasionally can get more drought-like. So we're trying to learn from the experience of those places, such as your work, so that we can anticipate future. So at the moment, we're not quite where you are, but I think that's it's an important general principle though, that you're talking about. I guess for me, I am interested a lot in the indoor-outdoor dichotomy, because the immediate response typically is it's safer inside than outside. the idea of people being on their own to kind of come up with is, what they're going to do is so such a common problem, and that's such a well stated by you in terms of what people are coming up with. But you then talked about being nuanced. So as a researcher, you're nuanced. The question is, how do we convey nuance to the public? What really kind of need. So I will you give an analogy for something else entirely, like blood pressure. We give a number, and then we say, if your blood pressure reaches this level, then you need to act. You need to go. This is a problem, or this is when you go to the emergency room, and so on. So for the issue of wildfires, and sometimes the data have a hard time catching up to, like, what do you actually know at the time?
Right.
How do you help translate nuance is really the question. What do you think our approach to that can be?
It's a really good question. And it's one that I think that's why I have become so passionate about Report Back, because I think it's allowed me the opportunity to have conversations with people on nuance. For that particular indoor-outdoor, with that one, our main goal was just to get people to understand that indoor air is not always by default perfectly clean air, right? So that was our first goal. And then the second goal really was just to introduce people to the fact that they can look up the air quality index. And from a research standpoint, absolutely there's going to be concerns with the air quality index. And I say that because in Oregon, we have a ton of monitors in our urban areas. Then you cross the mountains to the eastern side of the state, and I think I added up, there's maybe 5. So your closest monitor could be 50 miles away, which is now no longer relevant, right? So I have had to get very comfortable with the fact that what are important nuances to me as a researcher ultimately may not have the same relevance in the real world because we lose some of that nuance. But we sort of decided if we can get people to understand that indoor air quality is something they should be considering, and recognize that they have easy tools. You can pull open any weather app at this point and you can look up the air quality index. And if we can get them to understand, all right, you want to be below 50. If it's under 100, you're probably okay, not ideal. And then really getting them to think, all right, if it's over 100, should I be letting my kids play outside? Should schools be having practices? So we've stayed away from, like, the blood pressure analogy, right? We've stayed away from exact numbers because we're not entirely sure on that. But we're trying to get people to realize that it's not that, oh, you're under 100, everything's fine, versus you're over 100, everything's terrible. So just even introducing the concept of nuance is kind of where I've come from. And so hopefully then we're seeing differences. And I can share that I was influenced, one, by that radio show where people wrote in with some kind of terrifying hacks that they're using.
Yeah.
But I'll also say Oregon is a very unique place. We have people that are so obsessed with health and fitness, they were literally outside running when the air quality index was 800. So to put it in perspective, the AQI only goes up to 500. We exceeded it. We were over 800. They're literally choking on ash, and they were still running because they believed running is good for me. So I'm just sort of trying to break down that very lack of nuance thinking. That's a very long and involved answer.
No,
I apologize.
It's a great answer because I think that's very realistic to where we are, just to begin the conversations and not scaring people, which is something you also alluded to, and realizing that they're the ones going to make the decision. Is not.
I guess the last thing I'll say on that is because for so long in Oregon, the messaging was always just turn on your AC. A lot of people disconnected and they said, well, I don't have AC, so I guess there's nothing I can do. So they just stopped paying attention. So once we started pointing out, no, there are things you can do. There are free things you can do. So you don't have to spend a lot of money. You don't have to use a huge effort, but there are still things you can do to protect your health and your family. That also started getting people more engaged and realizing, like, okay, I can do something. I do have power in this situation. And then again, they were able to have that conversation around the nuance.
And one of the questions also is whether we should sometimes focus people's attention on the most at-risk populations. And those, again, I'm an epidemiologist, so that kind of tend to, we know for heat, for example, there are more at-risk individuals. Obviously, for wildfire smoke, anybody who's got a lung condition or by age or elderly. But, I think I'm wondering what your own experience or perspective is on messaging for subgroups, or as opposed to kind of a broader population messages.
I think that's a really good point. Obviously, my lessons have been very study specific. And as exposure scientists, we've done a little bit of work with like specific subpopulations, but typically we've been working with the broader population. But I think it was an epidemiologist who said this to me, who said, if you can protect the most susceptible, you're protecting everyone by default. So I guess my short answer to you is we haven't explicitly done that. I mean, I think in conversations, particularly if I know someone, if they share, they have a lung condition, they have a child with asthma, then that's where we're saying, okay, you're probably someone that wants to close your window even earlier, right? You're probably already paying attention to your indoor air quality. And so that's, again, another reason to not just have like that strict number necessarily, because some people are going to say, well, we're already feeling chest tightness before that. So I don't know that I fully cracked the code on how to report back data for all of these varieties, but I think that's why it is important to leave space to say that we're going to give you information. And I do try to provide resources so people can delve more into it, but to try and say, we're going to give you information and give you the tools to interpret it so that it works for you and your situations.
Well, I think that's a great approach. And I wouldn't expect at this stage that you could crack the code yet, but I think that's awesome. You've got a good start. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Well, thank you again very much so much for coming and presenting to us. Like I said, I found this very educational on the pitfalls and everything, and greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a lovely day.
You too. Thank you.
Mhm.